Where the Fireflies Went, a True Story. Prologue, the imprint of absence. There are moments that do not fade. They are not memories, not really. Memories are softer things, prone to fraying at the edges, their colors dulling with the relentless friction of time. No, these are imprints. Scars burned onto the soul, as vivid and searing as the day they were branded. For Colleen Nick, that imprint is a kaleidoscope of a summer evening. The sweet, dusty smell of a baseball diamond, the electric hum of stadium lights against a deepening twilight sky, and the sound of her daughter's laughter, a sound that now exists only in the haunted echo chamber of her mind. It is the absence that is most present. It is a physical thing, a cold draft in a warm room, an empty space at the dinner table that screams louder than any voice. For decades, this absence has had a name, Morgan. And it has a face, a 6-year-old girl with a bright, mischievous smile, a constellation of freckles across her nose, and blonde hair the color of spun sunshine. It is a face frozen in the amber of 1995, a ghost of childhood who never had the chance to grow old. This is not a story with an ending. Endings offer closure, a final chapter that allows the reader to close the book and walk away. This is a story of a door torn from its hinges, left gaping to the howling wind of the unknown. It is a story about how on a perfectly ordinary night in a perfectly ordinary town, in a place built for childhood joy, a monster walked out of the shadows and stole the sun. Chapter 1. An All-American Tapestry. Alma, Arkansas, in the summer of 1995, was the kind of town that felt like a memory even while you were living in it. Nestled in the Arkansas River Valley, it was a place of quiet, tree-lined streets, front porch swings, and a communal rhythm dictated by the seasons. Football in the fall, holidays in the winter, and the glorious, sacred ritual of Little League baseball in the summer. It was the spinach capital of the world, a quirky claim to fame that spoke to its humble agrarian roots. Life here was meant to be safe. It was built on the bedrock assumption that neighbors watched out for one another, that children could play outside until the streetlights flickered on, their only predators the mosquitoes whining in the humid air. On Friday, June 9th, 1995, this assumption was as solid as the sun-baked earth. The air was thick and warm, smelling of cut grass, cheap beer, and the buttery perfume of popcorn wafting from the concession stand at the Wofford and Fallis ballpark. It was a perfect night for a game. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless canvas bleeding from azure to bruised purple at the horizon. For Colleen Nick, it was a typical end to a busy week. She had her 3 children in tow, 12-year-old Jessica, 9-year-old Logan, and the family's vibrant 6-year-old firecracker, Morgan Chantel Nick. Morgan was the exclamation point at the end of the family's sentence. She was a whirlwind of energy and questions, a child with an old soul's empathy and a pixie's mischief. She had recently learned to read and was immensely proud of it, sounding out words on cereal boxes and road signs with a fierce concentration that would melt into a triumphant, gap-toothed grin. That evening, Morgan was wearing her favorite green Girl Scout shirt, a pair of denim shorts, and white sneakers, the kind with lights in the heels that flashed with every step. She was a tiny, strobing beacon of pure, unadulterated joy. Her friends, Tia and TJ, were there, and the 3 of them were a blur of motion, their world contained within the thrilling ecosystem of the ballpark. They weren't watching the game, they were living in its margins, chasing each other up and down the metal bleachers, their sneakers clanging a rhythmic metallic beat, their high-pitched shrieks cutting through the low murmur of the crowd and the sharp crack of the bat. Colleen watched them from her seat, a familiar mix of maternal love and mild exasperation on her face. She was a mother hen, constantly counting her chicks. She saw Morgan's blonde head bobbing through the small crowd, a flash of her green shirt near the dugout. She saw her laughing, her face flushed with the heat and the thrill of the chase. These were the moments that formed the tapestry of a happy childhood. The threads of normalcy and safety woven so tightly together that the thought of them ever unraveling was unimaginable. As the game wound down, the sun finally surrendered to the night. The powerful stadium lights took over, casting the field in a stark, artificial brilliance, but plunging the periphery into a world of deep, impenetrable shadows. The parking lot, the grassy verges, the line of trees beyond the outfield fence, they all became part of a different, darker landscape. The air grew cooler, carrying the chirping of crickets, and with the twilight, something else emerged: the fireflies. They began to appear at the edge of the light's reach, blinking on and off like scattered diamonds on black velvet. For the children, it was a magical summons. "Mom, can we go catch fireflies?" Morgan pleaded, her eyes wide and earnest. Her friends echoed the request, a chorus of hopeful young voices. Colleen hesitated. It was getting late, around 10:20 p.m. The game was in its final inning. The crowd was beginning to thin, the symphony of the ballpark winding down to a few final notes. Her maternal instinct, that quiet, persistent hum of caution, vibrated within her. "No, honey, it's almost time to go. Stay here." But Morgan was persistent. It was the last thing she wanted to do on this perfect summer night. "Please, Mom, we'll be right over there. We'll be careful." She pointed toward the parking lot, just a stone's throw from their bleacher seats. Colleen looked at her daughter's face, a portrait of hopeful petition. She looked at her friends, their faces mirroring the same plea. They were in a familiar place, surrounded by familiar people. What could possibly happen? It was a small, fatal calculation of risk, the kind parents make 100 times a day. "Okay," she relented, "but you stay together and you don't go far. I'll be watching." Morgan's face lit up. "We will," she promised, already turning to run, her light-up sneakers flashing red, red, red as she disappeared with her friends into the growing dark. Colleen watched them go, a small knot of unease tightening in her stomach, a feeling she dismissed as typical parental anxiety. She turned her attention back to the game for a moment, gathering their blankets and bags, preparing for the exit. It was only a few minutes, maybe 5 at the most. But in that brief sliver of time, the tapestry of their lives was about to be shredded beyond all recognition. Chapter 2. The Man in the Blue Truck. The darkness at the edge of a well-lit space is deceptive. It feels like a wall, solid and inert. But it is porous, it breathes, and sometimes things crawl out of it. Morgan and her friends didn't go far. They were near Colleen's car, a teal minivan parked under the faint glow of a distant lot light. The fireflies were dancing just as they'd hoped, their intermittent pulses a silent, mesmerizing language. The children were laughing, their hands cupped to trap the magical insects. But they were not alone. Later, the other children would piece together a chilling mosaic of what they saw. A man. He was standing near a pickup truck, a strange, solitary figure in the thinning crowd. He wasn't watching the game, he was watching them. They described him as creepy. It's a child's word, simple and unadorned, but it carries a primal weight. It speaks to an innate, animal instinct for danger, a recognition of the predator before the threat is made plain. He spoke to them. His words were innocuous, friendly on the surface, but the intent beneath was something cold and sharp. The children, sensing the wrongness of the situation, grew uncomfortable. They began to drift back toward the safety of the stadium lights, back toward their parents. All except Morgan. She had stopped by her mother's minivan. The day's play had left her sneakers full of sand, and the tiny pebbles were irritating her feet. She sat on the pavement, a small, focused figure in the gloom, and took off her white shoes to empty them. It was a simple, childlike act. She was a stone's throw from her mother, from safety. She was just shaking the sand from her shoes. This was the last time any of her friends saw her. A minute or two later, her friends reached their own parents, the strange man momentarily forgotten in the excitement of reuniting. Back in the bleachers, Colleen finished packing. The game was over. The victorious team was celebrating, and the last of the spectators were making their way to the exits. "Morgan!" Colleen called out, her voice clear and strong in the cooling air. "Time to go!" Silence. Only the sound of crickets and the distant murmur of departing families. A flicker of annoyance. Morgan knew better than to wander off. "Morgan!" she called again, louder this time, a sharper edge to her voice. Still nothing. The knot of unease in her stomach, once a small, tight ball, began to unfurl, its tendrils cold and sharp. This wasn't right. Logan and Jessica, sensing the shift in their mother's tone, stood close by, their own faces clouding with concern. "I'm going to go get her," Colleen said, her voice tight. She walked briskly toward the parking lot, her heart starting to beat a little faster. The area where she had last seen the kids was now eerily empty. The fireflies still blinked, indifferent. She reached her minivan. On the pavement, right beside the driver's side door, sat a pair of small white sneakers. One was overturned, a tiny pyramid of sand spilled beside it. The world stopped. It was not a slow-motion cinematic moment. It was a violent, instantaneous fracture of reality. The sight of those shoes, so empty, so abandoned, was a physical blow. The air rushed from Colleen's lungs. The sounds of the ballpark faded into a deafening roar in her ears. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. It was a wild animal clawing its way up her throat. "Morgan!" The name was not a call anymore. It was a scream, a ragged, tearing sound ripped from the deepest part of her. She began to run, her eyes darting into the deep shadows between the parked cars, under the bleachers toward the dark line of trees. "Morgan! Jessica! Logan! Help me find your sister!" The other children, now alerted to the rising panic, began to point, to talk. Their fragmented observations started to coalesce into a terrifying picture. The creepy man, the truck, witnesses, adults now, would later corroborate parts of the story. They recalled a suspicious-looking man lingering in the area, and they remembered a truck. It was an older model, a red or maroon Ford pickup, distinctive because of the custom-made, mismatched white camper shell that sat awkwardly on its bed. It had been parked nearby, and now, like Morgan, it was gone. The man was a ghost, a cipher. The description was terrifyingly vague. A white male, tall and thin, probably in his 20s or 30s, maybe blonde hair, maybe light brown. He wore a ball cap and sunglasses, even at night. He was a phantom, deliberately obscuring himself. He had been there, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment, for the one child who lingered a few seconds too long. He had watched her sit down. He had seen her small and vulnerable, focused on the simple task of emptying her shoes. And in that moment, the porous darkness had opened, and he had stepped through, snatching her from the world and vanishing back into the night, leaving behind nothing but a pair of empty sneakers and a small pile of sand. Chapter 3: The Longest Night. The descent from parental panic to public emergency is a terrifyingly swift one. Within minutes, the ballpark, once a place of community and joy, transformed into the epicenter of a nightmare. The first police officer arrived on the scene at 10:45 p.m., just 15 to 20 minutes after Colleen had given Morgan permission to chase fireflies. But in the world of child abduction, 20 minutes is an eternity. It is a head start so vast it might as well be a different lifetime. The scene was one of controlled chaos, a stark juxtaposition of methodical police procedure and raw, human agony. Yellow tape was stretched across the parking lot, cordoning off Colleen's minivan and the terrible, silent testimony of Morgan's shoes. The stadium lights, which had earlier illuminated scenes of triumph and play, now cast a harsh, interrogative glare on a burgeoning crime scene. Officers with flashlights moved in methodical sweeps, their beams cutting through the darkness, searching for any sign, any clue, any piece of discarded clothing, anything that could tell them which way she went. For Colleen, these first hours were a blur of surreal horror. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was trapped in a state of suspended animation, her mind refusing to process the monstrous reality her heart already knew. She gave her statement to an officer, her voice trembling, the words catching in her throat. She described her daughter, 6 years old, 45 pounds, 3.5 feet tall, blonde hair, brown eyes. She described her green Girl Scout shirt, the denim shorts, the bright flashing sneakers that now sat in an evidence bag. Every detail was a fresh stab of pain. The other children were questioned, their young faces pale and frightened in the flashing blue and red lights of the patrol cars. They spoke of the creepy man, their voices small. An FBI sketch artist was brought in, and under the cold stadium lights, a face began to emerge from their fragmented descriptions. A gaunt, hollow-eyed visage that would become one of the most infamous composite sketches in the state's history. It was the face of a ghost, generic and yet chillingly specific in its predatory emptiness. As the night deepened, the search widened. Volunteers, parents, coaches, total strangers who had heard the news began to pour in, their faces grim with a shared sense of communal violation. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not in Alma, not at a little league game. They fanned out into the surrounding woods and fields, calling Morgan's name into the blackness. Their voices swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. A helicopter chopped the air overhead, its searchlight a single probing eye scanning the ground below. Colleen could only watch, helpless. Every shout of "Morgan!" that went unanswered was another turn of the screw. She was surrounded by people, by action, by the hum of official activity. Yet she had never felt more alone. Her two other children, Jessica and Logan, were taken to be cared for by family, their own childhoods irrevocably fractured by the night's events. Colleen remained at the scene, a statue of grief. Refusing to leave the last place her daughter had been, she clung to a desperate, slivering hope that it was all a misunderstanding, that Morgan was simply lost, hiding somewhere, scared, that she would be found curled up asleep under the bleachers or in the back seat of an unlocked car. But as the hours bled into one another, that hope began to decay, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The man in the red truck. The description was broadcast across the state, an Amber Alert before the Amber Alert system even existed. Roadblocks were set up, police departments in neighboring counties and states were notified. An invisible net was being cast, but everyone knew the horrifying truth. The abductor had a significant head start. He and Morgan could be anywhere. They could be across the state line, on some forgotten back road, disappearing deeper and deeper into the American heartland. The sun began to rise around 6 a.m. It was a cruel, beautiful dawn, the sky painted in soft pastels of pink and orange. The new light didn't bring hope. It brought clarity. It illuminated the grim faces of the searchers, the exhaustion etched into the lines around their eyes. It revealed the crime scene in stark, unforgiving detail. The tire tracks, the footprints, the empty space where a little girl should have been. For Colleen Nick, the sunrise was an obscenity. It marked the beginning of a new day, a day her daughter was not there to see. The world was moving on. The sun was rising. People were waking up to their normal lives. But her world had ended at 10:30 p.m. the previous night, in a dusty parking lot. The longest night of her life was over, but it was merely the prelude to an endless dawn of uncertainty and pain. She was no longer just a mother. She was the mother of a missing child, a title she would be forced to carry for the rest of her life. Chapter 4. The Echoes in the Void. In the days and weeks that followed Morgan's abduction, the town of Alma and the entire state of Arkansas were plunged into a state of collective shock and grief. The story was a national headline, a parent's worst nightmare broadcast into living rooms across the country. Morgan's smiling school picture was everywhere, on telephone poles and gas station windows, on the nightly news. Her face, so full of life and promise, became a haunting symbol of stolen innocence. The investigation was massive and immediate. The FBI joined the local police, bringing with them a vast array of resources. The composite sketch of the gaunt-faced man was ubiquitous, his hollow eyes staring out from newspapers and television screens. The description of the red Ford pickup with the white camper shell was a mantra repeated by every news anchor and police officer. A dedicated tip line was established, and it rang off the hook. This is the phase of a major investigation that teems with a frantic, desperate hope. Every phone call could be the one. Every sighting of a red truck, every report of a suspicious man was a jolt of adrenaline, a potential thread that could lead them out of the labyrinth. But it was like chasing ghosts. Leads poured in from all over the country. Red trucks were stopped and searched by the hundreds. Men who vaguely resembled the sketch were questioned. The community rallied, printing flyers, organizing search parties, holding prayer vigils. The hope was a palpable entity, a fragile bubble that everyone tried desperately to keep from bursting. But for Colleen, life became an excruciating exercise in waiting. She lived by the phone, her body in a constant state of high alert, jolting at every ring. She submitted to endless interviews, her voice raw with grief, pleading for her daughter's safe return. "Whoever has her, please just let her go," she begged, her words directed at a faceless monster she couldn't comprehend. "She's just a little girl. She needs her mommy. Please don't hurt my baby." As weeks turned into months, the character of the investigation began to shift. The frantic energy of the initial search subsided, replaced by the slow, grinding work of a long-term case. The national media moved on to the next tragedy, the next headline. The tip line rang less frequently. The bubble of hope, once so vibrant, grew thin and translucent. It hadn't burst, not entirely, but it was leaking, deflating with each passing day that brought no news. This is when a different kind of horror begins to set in. It is the horror of the void, of silence. The initial sharp agony of the event is replaced by the dull, chronic ache of the aftermath. The world, which had stopped for Colleen on June 9th, began to spin again for everyone else. People had to go back to their jobs, their lives. The yellow tape came down at the ballpark. Children played there again. But for the Nick family, the world remained fractured and frozen. The investigation was plagued by the abductor's terrifying efficiency. He had left behind almost nothing. No DNA, no fingerprints, no reliable license plate number. He was a phantom who had materialized out of the shadows and vanished back into them. His only trace the witness descriptions and the hole he had torn in a family's life. Psychics and charlatans emerged from the woodwork, preying on the family's desperation with false visions and cruel promises of closure. Every dead-end lead, every false hope, was a fresh wound. The police investigated known sex offenders in the region, pored over records, chased down whispers and rumors, but every path led to a cold dead end. One of the most promising and ultimately heartbreaking leads centered on a man named Billy Jack Lynx. He was a local man, a convicted felon who bore a passing resemblance to the composite sketch. He drove a pickup truck. A few years after Morgan's disappearance, his name surfaced in connection with another attempted abduction. When investigators searched his property after his death in 2000, they found a wealth of disturbing material, but no definitive forensic link to Morgan Nick. A single hair found in his truck was tested, but it wasn't a match. It was another door that seemed to promise an answer, only to be slammed shut. The case was a series of these phantom doors, each one leading back to the same empty hallway of the unknown. For Colleen, the silence was the enemy. The lack of answers was a form of torture, more profound than any single piece of bad news could ever be. Was Morgan alive? Was she being held somewhere, frightened and alone? Or had the worst already happened? The not knowing was a purgatory, a space between life and death, hope and despair. The monster who took her daughter had not just stolen her child, he had stolen her peace, her ability to grieve, her future. He had sentenced her to a life of looking for a ghost, of listening for a voice in an endless, echoing void. Chapter 5. The Warrior in the Maelstrom. There comes a point in the crucible of unimaginable grief where a person either shatters or is forged into something new. For Colleen Nick, the endless days of waiting and weeping, of pleading and praying, eventually gave way to a transformation. The profound, paralyzing sorrow did not disappear. It became the fuel. The helplessness she felt in the face of the silent, indifferent universe morphed into a white-hot, focused rage. A rage not for vengeance, but for action. She realized that the system, for all its effort, was not enough. In 1995, the response to a missing child case was not as swift or coordinated as it is today. The Amber Alert system, which would have blasted Morgan's description across the state within minutes, did not yet exist. Resources were fragmented. Support for the families of the missing was ad hoc and insufficient. Colleen found herself navigating a bureaucratic maze while trying to keep her own family from disintegrating under the strain.
She saw the gaps. She saw the other parents, the other faces on the missing posters, the other families trapped in the same hellish limbo as her own. And in that shared darkness, she found a purpose. If no one was going to build the road to bring her daughter home, she would pave it herself, stone by painful stone. In 1996, just a year after Morgan's abduction, Colleen Nick did something extraordinary. She founded the Morgan Nick Foundation. It began as a small grassroots effort run from her own home, a way to channel her pain into something constructive. Its mission was twofold: to provide immediate assistance to families of missing children and to prevent abductions through education. She became a warrior, the soft-spoken mother from Alma, Arkansas, transformed into a fierce, articulate, and relentless advocate. She learned to navigate the corridors of power in Little Rock and Washington, D.C. She spoke to lawmakers, to police chiefs, to community groups, her voice imbued with an authority that only someone who has lived the nightmare can possess. She was no longer just a victim of a horrific crime. She was a force of nature, a mother on a mission. The foundation became a beacon. It created Morgan's TIP, Take Immediate Picture Kits for parents. It developed safety education programs for schools, teaching children the very lessons that might have saved her own daughter: how to recognize tricky people, the importance of the buddy system, and the power of shouting, "No." It provided a 24-hour hotline for families in crisis, offering the kind of immediate support and guidance that Colleen had so desperately needed in those first chaotic hours. She was instrumental in bringing the Amber Alert system to Arkansas, fighting tirelessly for its implementation. She knew that the first few hours are the most critical, and that a coordinated, rapid response system could mean the difference between life and death for another child. Every time an alert is issued in Arkansas, it is an echo of her voice, a legacy born from her loss. This new role was a heavy armor. It allowed her to function, to fight, to put one foot in front of the other. But beneath it, the wound remained open and raw. Every new case Foundation assisted with was a reliving of her own trauma. Every scared parent she comforted, every missing child's face she saw, was a reflection of her own agony. The work was both her salvation and a constant reopening of the wound.
There was also the profound, gut-wrenching irony of her life's work. She was helping to find other people's children, celebrating their safe returns, while her own daughter remained lost in the void. She attended press conferences for recovered children, her heart filled with genuine joy for the families, but always with the sharp, stabbing pain of her own unresolved story. She had become an expert in a field she never wanted to enter, the nation's leading authority on a parent's worst fear. The foundation grew, becoming a nationally recognized organization. Colleen Nick became a respected voice in the missing children's advocacy community. But every night, when the phone calls stopped and the work was done, she was still just a mother, alone with her thoughts, staring at a picture of a 6-year-old girl with a gap-toothed smile, a girl frozen in time. The warrior could fight the world, but she couldn't silence the one question that haunted her every waking moment and stalked her dreams. Where are you, Morgan? Chapter 6: The Haunting of Hope. A cold case is not a dead case. It is a sleeping monster. It lies dormant for years, for decades, but it never truly dies. It breathes, it waits, and for the family at its heart, this state of perpetual limbo is a unique and cruel form of psychological torment. Hope, in a cold case, is not a gentle comfort. It is a heavy, jagged thing that you must carry every single day. Over the years, the investigation into Morgan Nick's disappearance has continued in fits and starts. New detectives inherit the thick, heavy binders filled with 20-plus years of reports, witness statements, and dead ends. New technologies emerge, offering tantalizing possibilities. Each development is a fresh spark in the darkness, threatening to either illuminate the truth or burn out, leaving the shadows deeper than before. One of the most haunting aspects of the long-term search is the science of age progression. Forensic artists at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have taken Morgan's 6-year-old face and digitally aged it, trying to imagine what she might look like as a teenager, a young woman, a woman now in her 30s.
The first few images were heartbreakingly plausible. They showed a young woman with her mother's jawline and her father's eyes, a ghost of the little girl still visible in her features. But as the years passed, the images became more speculative, more foreign. The age-progressed photo of Morgan in her 30s is the face of a stranger. It is a woman with laugh lines she never got to earn with her family, with the wisdom in her eyes gained from a life lived entirely in the unknown. For Colleen,
Seeing these images is a surreal and painful duty. She is forced to mourn the daughter she lost, while simultaneously searching for a woman she has never met. She has to familiarize herself with the face of a stranger in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize her. A coworker, a neighbor, a cashier at a grocery store. It's a search for two people at once, the ghost of a 6-year-old girl and the hypothetical woman she became. Advances in DNA technology have offered the most potent and often most frustrating glimmers of hope. In 2017, investigators returned to the ballpark in Elma, the scene of the crime, with ground-penetrating radar, searching for any sign of a grave. They found nothing. In recent years, items of interest have been seized and sent for advanced DNA testing, a process that can take months or even years. News of these tests creates a flurry of media attention and a spike of public hope. The Nick family is once again thrown onto a roller coaster of anticipation and dread, waiting for a phone call that could change everything or, just as likely, confirm nothing. The case took another dramatic turn in 2021 when federal agents and local police swarmed a private residence in Spiro, Oklahoma, conducting an intensive, days-long search of the property. The home belonged to a man who was a person of interest, now deceased. The air was thick with speculation. This was it, everyone thought. After 26 years, this was the breakthrough. But after digging up the property and processing the evidence, the official word was once again crushing. No definitive link to Morgan's case was found. Another promising lead dissolved into thin air. Each of these moments is a public spectacle and a private agony. For the world, it's a gripping true crime update. For Colleen, it is her life. She must balance her fierce, unwavering hope with a brutal self-preservation, steeling herself for the disappointment that has become a familiar companion. The monster who took Morgan remains a ghost. The man in the composite sketch has aged too. Is he still alive? Is he in prison for some other crime? His connection to Morgan's case buried in a file? Or did he die, taking his secret to the grave? These are the questions that circle in the dark. The haunting of hope is the refusal to give up, even when logic and the passage of time suggest you should. It's the act of keeping a light on in the window for someone who may never be able to see it. It's a testament to a mother's love. A love so powerful it defies decades of silence. A love that continues to search for a little girl who went to catch fireflies one summer night and simply, terrifyingly, vanished into the dark. Epilogue. The Wofford and Follis Ballpark in Alma, Arkansas still stands. On summer nights, the lights still hum, the bats still crack, and a new generation of children still chase each other in the margins, their laughter echoing in the humid air. But the place is different now. It is forever marked, forever a part of a darker story. A shadow lingers at the edge of the parking lot, a permanent chill that even the hottest summer day cannot erase. Parents hold their children a little closer here. They watch the descending twilight with a little more suspicion. The story of Morgan Nick is more than a cold case. It is a piece of American folklore, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation of parents to the next. It is a stark reminder that the membrane between safety and unspeakable horror is terrifyingly thin, and that it can be pierced in the most ordinary of places, at the most ordinary of times.
The red truck with the white camper shell was never found.
The man with the hollow eyes in the sketch was never identified. He remains a specter, a manifestation of pure evil who stepped into a family's life for a few brief moments and left behind a lifetime of devastation. He is a ghost who haunts not just the Nick family, but every parent who has ever felt a flicker of fear when their child wanders out of sight. Colleen Nick is still fighting. Her hair is grayer now, the lines on her face deeper, etched there by decades of sorrow and struggle. But her eyes still burn with the same fierce, unwavering fire. The Morgan Nick Foundation has become a powerful force for good, a legacy of hope built on a foundation of pain. It has helped in the recovery of countless children and educated millions more. In a world that can be dark and predatory, Colleen Nick became a lighthouse. But lighthouses, for all the ships they guide to safety, cannot illuminate their own foundations. The core of her story remains shrouded in an impenetrable darkness. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, one can't help but return to that final, heartbreaking image, a 6-year-old girl, sitting in the gloom of a parking lot, her head bent in concentration as she carefully empties the sand from her small white shoes. It is the last known moment of her childhood, the last moment of her life as she knew it. In the seconds that followed, her world and the world of everyone who loved her was extinguished as completely and as silently as a firefly's light blinked out against the vast and terrible blackness of the night. The search for Morgan Nick continues. Hope, in its most stubborn and painful form, endures. And the question, the same one screamed into the darkness on June 9th, 1995, still hangs in the Arkansas air, unanswered. Where is Morgan?
What the train didn't kill. The night in Saline County, Arkansas has a weight to it. It's not just the humidity, a thick, wet blanket that smothers you in the dog days of August. It's a historical weight, a heaviness that settles in the pine-choked hollows and clings to the kudzu-strangled trees. It's a place where secrets can take root in the red clay soil and grow in the dark, undisturbed for generations. On the night of August 22, 1987, that darkness was preparing to swallow 2 boys whole. Kevin Ives, 17, was the kind of kid who seemed to have life figured out. He was handsome, popular, and carried himself with an easy confidence. He was a drummer in a local band, his future a bright, open road. His best friend, Don Henry, 16, was quieter, more introspective, but with a fierce loyalty that bound him to Kevin. Don was a gifted hunter at home in the woods, with a knowledge of the land that belied his years. They were an inseparable pair, 2 sides of the same youthful coin, standing on the cusp of manhood with the entire world laid out before them. Their last night on Earth began with the simple, timeless ritual of teenage freedom, a late-night cruise. Kevin's car, the hum of the engine a familiar comfort, cut through the thick Arkansas air. Later, they met up with some friends. The plan, as it was pieced together later, was classic small-town adventure. Don, with his .22 caliber rifle, was going night hunting, a local term for using a spotlight to illegally hunt deer. It was a bit of reckless fun, the kind of mischief that boys in rural America had engaged in for a century. They said their goodbyes to their friends around midnight near a local grocery store and headed toward the railroad tracks that snaked through the woods behind Kevin's house. They were last seen alive around 12:30 a.m., walking into the tangled wilderness that bordered the tracks, Don's rifle slung over his shoulder. They told a friend they'd be back in a couple of hours. They never came back. The first tendrils of dread crept into the Ives household as the sun began to warm the morning sky. Linda Ives, Kevin's mother, woke with the specific primal anxiety known only to a parent whose child is not in their bed. She called Don's house. No, he hadn't come home either. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Kevin was responsible. He always called, always. Frantic calls were made. Friends were questioned. A search began, informal at first, just worried parents and friends combing the familiar paths and hangouts. Curtis Ives, Kevin's father, drove his truck along the gravel service roads that paralleled the railroad line, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. The official word came like a physical blow. At 4:25 a.m., the crew of a northbound Union Pacific freight train, a 7,000-ton behemoth pulling 75 cars, had reported hitting something on the tracks near Crooked Creek Trestle. The engineer, Stephen Schroyer, had seen a shape on the rails. In the locomotive's powerful headlight, it looked like 2 bodies, partially covered by a pale green tarp. He'd blasted the horn, a deafening shriek that ripped through the pre-dawn quiet and slammed on the emergency brakes. But a monster of that size and speed doesn't stop on a dime. It takes over a mile. The train rolled on, its steel wheels doing the unspeakable. When the Saline County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, what they found was a tableau of pure horror. The boys' bodies were mangled, dismembered by the train's immense force. It was a gruesome, devastating sight. Don's .22 rifle lay beside the tracks, undamaged. Sheriff James H. Steamer Pirtle, the county's top lawman, surveyed the scene. Before the sun was fully up,
Before a proper investigation could even begin, the official narrative was already being written. The boys, he surmised, had probably smoked too much marijuana, gotten high, and simply fallen asleep on the tracks, oblivious to the approaching train. It was a tragic, foolish, but ultimately simple accident. The county coroner quickly concurred. Case closed. For the families, drowning in a grief so profound it felt like the end of the world, this explanation was a second, crueler blow. It didn't just rob them of their sons. It smeared their memory with the stain of recklessness and stupidity. But for Linda Ives, the story felt wrong. It felt hollow. It was a lie she could feel in her bones. Her son, an experienced outdoorsman, falling asleep on a railroad track? Don Henry, who knew these woods like the back of his hand, doing the same? It was impossible. Two boys at the same time, in the same place? The statistical improbability was staggering.
And then there was the matter of the green tarp. The train's crew was adamant. They saw a tarp covering the boys. But when the deputies arrived, there was no tarp to be found. It had vanished, as if the morning mist had simply dissolved it. This discrepancy was the first loose thread in a story that would soon unravel into a tapestry of conspiracy, corruption, and murder so dark it would haunt Arkansas for decades. The official ruling was handed down by the state's chief medical examiner, the infamous Dr. Fahmy Malak. His report was swift and decisive. Accidental death. Cause: massive blunt force trauma from being struck by the train. Contributing factor: THC intoxication. He claimed the boys had smoked upwards of 20 marijuana cigarettes, a quantity so large it would have induced a deep, comatose-like stupor. The families were aghast. 20 joints? It sounded less like a medical diagnosis and more like a scene from a Cheech and Chong movie. It was character assassination disguised as forensic science. Linda Ives, her grief now hardened into a diamond edge of resolve, refused to accept it. She began her own investigation, transforming from a grieving mother into a relentless detective. She spoke again to the train crew. They told her more. They said the boys were lying perfectly straight, side by side, their bodies aligned with the rails. It wasn't the posture of two people who had simply collapsed in a drug-induced haze. It was deliberate. It was staged. The more Linda and the Henrys dug, the more the official story crumbled. Friends of the boys came forward, whispering that Don and Kevin were terrified of those tracks. They knew how fast and how quietly the trains could approach. They would never, ever have lingered there, let alone slept there. The families pooled their money, a collection of small-town savings and donations from a sympathetic community, and made a decision that would change everything. They would have the boys' bodies exhumed for a second autopsy. They hired Dr. Joseph Burton, a renowned forensic pathologist from Atlanta, a man with a reputation for uncovering truths that others wanted to keep buried. In November 1987, the small caskets were raised from the cold Arkansas ground. The exhumation felt like a desecration, a violation of the boys' final rest, but it was a necessary one. Dr. Burton conducted his examination, and what he found was not a tragedy, but an atrocity. His report landed like a bomb. The trauma from the train, he concluded, was post-mortem. It had happened after the boys were already dead or dying. In Kevin Ives's case, the evidence was clear. His skull had been violently crushed by a blow from a blunt object, likely the butt of a rifle. Don Henry's body held an even more chilling secret. Beneath the damage from the train, Dr. Burton found a clear, distinct puncture wound in his back, piercing his shirt and his chest. Don Henry had been stabbed. The boys hadn't fallen asleep on the tracks. They'd been murdered. They'd been beaten and stabbed somewhere else, then dragged to the rails and laid out like an offering, a human sacrifice to the midnight train. The green tarp was likely used to carry their bodies. The train was not the instrument of their death. It was the intended instrument of a cover-up, a monstrous machine meant to obliterate the evidence of a brutal double homicide. Dr. Malak's marijuana-induced stupor was a fabrication. The boys were victims, and their killers were still out there. The case was no longer an accident, it was a murder investigation. And with that revelation, Linda Ives and the Henry family had unknowingly kicked open the door to a part of Arkansas that was meant to stay hidden. A shadowy world of drug trafficking, political corruption, and police complicity that reached the highest levels of power. With the murder verdict from Dr. Burton, a Saline County grand jury was convened in 1988 to investigate the boys' deaths.
The man appointed as special prosecutor to lead the charge was a charismatic, ambitious local attorney named Dan Harmon. To the families, he seemed like a godsend, a crusader who would finally bring them justice. But Harmon was a man of deep and troubling contradictions, a figure who would become a central, sinister character in the deepening mystery. As the grand jury began to hear testimony, a chilling picture of the woods near the tracks began to emerge. It wasn't just a place for teenage mischief, it was a drop zone. On moonless nights, small planes would fly in low, dropping waterproof packages filled with cocaine into the wilderness. The packages were then retrieved by a ground crew, which included, according to hushed whispers and anonymous tips, local police officers. The theory that formed was terrifyingly plausible. On that August night, Don and Kevin, out on their night hunt, had stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. Perhaps they saw the flash of a plane's lights, or the shadowy figures of men retrieving a package. Perhaps, in their youthful naivety, they were seen. They were witnesses, and in the high-stakes world of drug smuggling, witnesses were a liability that had to be eliminated.
The grand jury, under Harmon's direction, seemed to be making progress. Witnesses were called, some of them shady characters from the local underworld, others just terrified residents who had seen or heard things they were afraid to speak of. But a strange pattern began to emerge. Key witnesses would be scheduled to testify, only to have their testimony delayed or canceled by Harmon. Evidence seemed to disappear. The investigation, which had started with such promise, began to stall and meander. Linda Ives, her initial trust in Harmon eroding into suspicion, felt that he wasn't pursuing justice, but controlling it. He seemed to be steering the investigation away from certain individuals, particularly law enforcement officials. Then, the people who might have held the answers started to die. Keith Coney, a friend of the boys, had told people he was with Kevin and Dawn on the night they were killed, and had seen what happened. He was terrified. Before he could testify to the grand jury, he fled on his motorcycle, panicked. He crashed and died from his injuries. The official report said he lost control. His family said he was run off the road. Booney Bearden, another potential witness who claimed to have information, vanished without a trace. He has never been seen again. The most shocking death was that of Richard Garrett. A 26-year-old who worked at a local nightclub, Garrett was brought before the grand jury after telling a pastor he had witnessed the murders. He was visibly shaken, terrified for his life. He claimed to have seen two law enforcement officers beat the boys after an altercation related to a drug deal. Just days after his testimony, Garrett was found dead in a field, a single gunshot wound to his head. His death was immediately ruled a suicide, but the evidence screamed murder. He had been found with his own blood on the bottoms of his shoes, suggesting he had been killed elsewhere and dragged to the spot. The suicide note was written by a left-handed person. Garrett was right-handed. The message was brutally clear. Talk, and you die. The horror was no longer confined to that single night on the tracks. It was a creeping act of malevolence, silencing anyone who dared to speak the truth. The conspiracy was real, and it was protecting itself with violence. Amid the chaos, the grand jury did something unprecedented. Frustrated with Dan Harmon's handling of the case, they wrote a letter to the judge, essentially firing him as their prosecutor. They felt he was actively obstructing their investigation. They issued a scathing final report, confirming their belief that Dawn and Kevin were murdered, and that the original investigation had been botched, possibly intentionally. But without a prosecutor willing to press charges, they could name no names and issue no indictments. The grand jury was dismissed. The case went cold. The darkness had won. Years bled into one another. The train continued to rumble through the Arkansas night, its lonesome whistle a mournful reminder of the unanswered questions that hung over Saline County. The case of the boys on the tracks became a piece of local lore, a ghost story whispered among teenagers, a cautionary tale about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for Linda Ives, it was never a story. It was her life's work. She became a nationally recognized advocate for victims' rights and government accountability. She sued Dr. Fahmy Malek, forcing a settlement and contributing to the eventual end of his controversial career. She meticulously cataloged every lead, every witness, every dead end, creating a massive private archive of the case. And what of Dan Harmon, the prosecutor who promised justice and delivered obstruction? His ambition eventually consumed him. Years later, he would finally be brought down.
not for the boy's murders, but for the very crimes he was suspected of covering up. He was convicted in 1997 on federal charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and drug distribution, running the very same kind of criminal enterprise he was supposed to be prosecuting. He was sentenced to federal prison, a small measure of karmic justice, but it brought no answers about Kevin and Dawn. Over the years, more witnesses came forward, their stories painting an ever clearer picture of that night. One man, a former professional wrestler and drug trafficker, confessed on his deathbed to a filmmaker investigating the case. He claimed he was part of the ground crew that night. He said the boys stumbled upon them. There was a confrontation, and a police officer, who he named, panicked and began beating Kevin with his flashlight. When Dawn tried to intervene, he was stabbed. The wrestler described how they carried the boys in a green tarp to the tracks, a story that perfectly matched the train crew's testimony and Dr. Burton's forensic findings.
Another witness, a woman who dated one of the suspected killers, came forward with a story that was even more chilling. She said her boyfriend came home that night, covered in blood, and confessed to her. "We had to kill them," he'd said. "The boys saw too much." He named a prominent local official as the man who gave the order. This woman lived in fear for years, but eventually provided a sworn affidavit. The names are known. They're whispered in the diners and bars of Saline County. They're the names of former police officers, local businessmen, and political figures. They walk free. They have grown old. Some have died. But they have never faced a courtroom for what they did to Kevin Ives and Dawn Henry. The evidence is vast but circumstantial, built on the testimony of witnesses who were either dead, terrified, or themselves involved in the criminal underworld. The official case file remains open but inactive, gathering dust in a file cabinet, a testament to a justice system that, in this case, failed utterly. To visit the tracks today is an eerie experience. The spot just past the Crooked Creek Trestle is quiet. The sun dapples through the canopy of pine and oak. You can hear birdsong and the buzz of insects. It seems peaceful, but if you stand there long enough, you can feel it, the weight, the heaviness of what happened here. You can almost hear the echo of the train's horn, the frantic shouts in the dark, the final, terrified breaths of two boys whose only crime was seeing something they shouldn't have. The real horror of this story isn't just the brutal murder of two teenagers. It's the slow, creeping horror of the cover-up that followed. It's the horror of a system that protects its own, even when its own are monsters. It's the realization that the people sworn to protect you can be the very ones you should fear the most. What happened to Dawn Henry and Kevin Ives is an American horror story, made all the more terrifying because it is true. It's a story about a freight train that was used to hide a crime, but it's also about a train of corruption that ran right through the heart of a small American town, crushing everything in its path. And somewhere, in the deep, dark woods of Arkansas, the truth lies buried, waiting for a day of reckoning that may never come. A final, chilling secret kept by the boys on the tracks, and by the thing that the train didn't kill.
The Ceaseless Watch of the Gurdon Light. A true story of murder, myth, and a light that never dies.
The air in southern Arkansas has a weight to it, a physical presence you can feel on your skin. In the summer, it's a smothering blanket of humidity, thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the sweet decay of the swamp. It's an ancient air, one that has absorbed the whispers of the quapaw, the sweat of the timbermen, and the blood of those who met their end along the lonely miles of steel that cut through the wilderness. It is an air that holds stories. And the most persistent, most chilling of them all, belongs to the railroad tracks just outside the small town of Gurdon. It's a story that begins not with a ghost, but with the quiet desperation of the Great Depression. Part 1. The Weight of the World. December 1931. The year 1931 had bled the hope from most men. It was a time of breadlines and bone-deep weariness, where a day's wage was the only thing standing between a family and starvation. For the section crews of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, the work was a brutal bargain with the devil.
10 hours a day, under a merciless sun or in a bone-chilling winter drizzle, taming the wild land for the iron horse. The rhythmic clang of the spike maul against steel was the heartbeat of their survival. William "Bill" Keating was the foreman of Section Gang 63. A man forged from the same hard iron as the rails he commanded, Keating was fair in the way a rock slide is fair, uncompromising, unmovable, and utterly indifferent to the struggles of the pebbles in its path. He demanded perfection because the railroad demanded it of him. A loose spike, a misaligned rail, could mean derailment. It could mean death. He had no room for excuses, especially not from men he saw as weak. Lou McLean was one of those men. Younger than Keating, with a wife and 2 small children whose hungry faces were seared into his mind's eye, McLean worked with a frantic energy, born of fear. The Depression had chewed up and spat out better men than him. This job was everything. But the grueling labor, the poor nutrition, and the constant gnawing anxiety were taking their toll. His work was becoming sloppy. His hands shook. His swings with the heavy maul were sometimes wide, his focus blurred by exhaustion.
The friction between the 2 men had been growing for weeks, a low hum of resentment beneath the din of the worksite. Keating saw McLean's fumbling as insolence. McLean saw Keating's constant criticism as a personal vendetta, the bullying of a man who had forgotten what it was like to be desperate. The breaking point arrived on a cold, gray Tuesday in early December. A biting wind swept across the cleared trackbed, carrying with it the smell of rain and the promise of a miserable afternoon. McLean, his hands numb and his stomach a hollow ache, was struggling to set a spike. His first swing glanced off the head, sending a painful vibration up his arm. Keating's voice cut through the air, sharp as a shard of glass. "McLean, are you trying to drive it in or dance with it? A child could do better." The other men, gaunt figures in patched denim, stopped their work, their faces impassive. Public humiliation was a tool Keating used often. McLean's face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. "The wood's frozen solid, Bill. It ain't taken the spike easy. The wood is fine. Your arm is weak," Keating retorted, striding over. He was a broad, imposing figure, his shadow falling over McLean. "You've been sloppy for a month. I've warned you. The Missouri Pacific doesn't pay for sloppy." "I'm doing my best," McLean mumbled, his eyes fixed on the rail tie. "Your best ain't good enough," Keating snapped. He pointed a thick, calloused finger down the tracks toward Gurdon. "Get your things. You're done. Go draw your time." The world stopped. The wind died. The clang of the hammers ceased. For McLean, the foreman's words were not just a firing. They were a death sentence for his family. He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Bill, please. I got kids. I need this job. I'll do better. I swear it." Keating's face was stone. "Should have thought of your kids when you were daydreaming on the job. Now get out of my sight before I have you thrown off the line." Something inside Lou McLean, a wire stretched taut by months of poverty and fear, finally snapped. The desperation curdled into a black, venomous rage. He didn't say another word. He dropped his maul with a thud, turned, and began the long, cold walk back to town. But he wasn't thinking about his final pay. He was thinking about the injustice. He was thinking about the smug, unyielding look on Bill Keating's face. He was thinking about the heavy, cast-iron heft of a spike maul.
That night, a cold drizzle began to fall, slicking the gravel between the ties and turning the surrounding woods into a labyrinth of black, skeletal shapes. Bill Keating, a creature of habit, did his final inspection of the day's work. He walked the new stretch of track alone, his kerosene lantern swinging by his side, casting a single dancing orb of yellow light into the oppressive darkness. The light bobbed and weaved, a lone star in a sea of ink, as Keating checked the integrity of the spikes. His spikes, driven home with the force and precision he demanded. He never heard the footsteps on the damp gravel behind him. Lou McLean had waited. He had let the rage simmer and cool into a hard, purposeful resolve. He confronted Keating on the tracks, the site of his humiliation. The argument was brief, a flare of hot words in the cold night air. It was Keating's final, dismissive curse that sealed his fate. The first blow from the spike maul was to the back of the head.
Keating crumpled without a sound, his lantern falling to the gravel, its glass shattering but the flame, miraculously, still flickering. What followed was an act of pure, frenzied butchery. Fueled by a rage that had transcended reason, McLean brought the heavy tool down again and again. In his fury, he did more than just kill the foreman. He separated his head from his body. Panting, standing over the grotesque scene, the magnitude of his actions crashed down on McLean. Panic seized him. He had to hide the body. He dragged Keating's torso into the thick, thorny underbrush of the adjacent swamp, the cypress knees like grasping, bony fingers in the gloom. He shoved it deep into the muck and tangled vines. Then he turned back for the head. But in the disorienting darkness, with only the weak, flickering flame from the broken lantern to guide him, he couldn't find it. He scrambled through the briars and mud, his hands searching, patting the cold, wet ground. The head was gone, swallowed by the swamp. The flickering lantern, his only guide, finally sputtered and died, plunging him into absolute blackness. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced his rage. He had left a crucial piece of evidence behind. Worse, he had left a part of the man's soul untethered. Giving up his search, McLean fled into the night. A murderer, haunted by the image of a single, searching light. The next day, the section crew found Keating's headless body. The town of Gurdon was gripped by a horror it had never known. A manhunt ensued, and it didn't take long for the law to focus on the disgruntled worker who had been fired the day before. Lou McLean was captured, tried, and eventually executed for his crime. The case was closed. The murderer was punished. But something was left behind on those lonely tracks. A violent, traumatic energy had been stamped into the very land itself. And soon after, the sightings began. A lone, bobbing light, seen at a distance down the tracks. A soft, ethereal glow, sometimes white, sometimes blue, sometimes orange, that would appear out of nowhere, hover, and then vanish. The old-timers knew what it was. It was Bill Keating's ghost, holding his lantern. It was the spirit of the murdered foreman, forever searching the swamps and the railway line for his missing head. Part 2. The Believers and the Skeptic. Present day. 80-odd years later, the legend of the Gurdon Light had grown from a local ghost story into a full-blown paranormal phenomenon. It had been featured on television shows, studied by investigators, and had become a rite of passage for thrill-seeking teenagers across Arkansas. Which is what brought Dr. Alistair Finch and his team to the tracks on a sweltering August night. Alistair was a parapsychologist, a title he wore with a mixture of academic pride and weary defensiveness. He was a man of science, a debunker at heart, but one who remained stubbornly open to the possibility of the unexplainable. His team was a familiar archetype in their field. There was Maya, the historian and researcher, her tablet filled with newspaper clippings from 1931, maps and witness testimonies. There was Ben, the tech specialist, laden with an arsenal of EMF meters, thermal cameras, audio recorders, and a drone he called Icarus. And there was a new addition, a young grad student named Chloe, whose official role was intern, but whose unofficial talent was a sharp, unnerving intuition. She called it empathy. Alistair privately called it the canary in the coal mine. The official explanation, of course, is swamp gas, Alistair said, his voice a calm lecture as they walked from their parked SUV toward the infamous stretch of track. The air was a wall of heat, and a deafening chorus of cicadas and frogs rose from the woods on either side. Methane and other phosphine gases bubble up from the decaying organic matter, and under certain atmospheric conditions, they can spontaneously ignite, creating a brief, flickering light. Or, Ben chimed in, adjusting the pack on his shoulders, it's the piezoelectric effect. Gurdon sits on a fault line. The ground here is rich in quartz crystals. Tectonic stress could theoretically cause the crystals to release an electrical charge, ionizing the air and creating a visible glow. Maya swiped through her tablet, neither of which explains the consistency of the sightings or the anecdotal evidence of it interacting with people. The reports from the 40s and 50s, long before Interstate 30 was built, rule out the headlight reflection theory for the early sightings. One witness from 1958 swore it followed him for half a mile, staying a constant distance away. They reached the tracks. The creosote-soaked railroad ties radiated a tar-like smell under the last vestiges of the setting sun. The steel rails gleamed, two silver lines stretching into an infinite, darkening tunnel of trees. The woods crowded in on them, tall pines and gnarled oaks draped in Spanish moss that hung like gray, tattered shrouds. It was a place that felt primal, isolated, a corridor between worlds. "And what do you think, Chloe?" Alistair asked, turning to the quiet intern. Chloe hugged her arms to her chest, despite the heat. "I think this place is sad," she said softly. "It's not just the murder. It's heavy. Like the air is full of old echoes." Alistair gave a non-committal grunt and turned to Ben. "All right, let's set up a baseline. EMF, ambient temperature, full spectrum cameras at 50-yard intervals. I want this whole stretch covered." As Ben began methodically setting up his equipment, a low rumble grew in the distance. A pair of headlights pierced the twilight, and a freight train thundered past them, its horn blasting a deafening, mournful cry. The ground shook, the wind of its passage whipping at their clothes. For a full minute, it was a cacophony of screeching wheels and roaring engines. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone, its red taillights shrinking into the distance, leaving behind a profound and unsettling silence.
The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise. The cicadas seemed to have paused, as if holding their breath. The world felt empty, waiting. "Okay," Ben said, his voice sounding small in the vast quiet. "We're hot. All systems are go." They settled in for the wait. The sun disappeared completely, and a darkness unlike city darkness fell upon them. It was absolute, a physical substance that seemed to press in from the trees, broken only by the pinprick of stars in the sky and the faint red and green status lights on Ben's equipment. They spoke in hushed tones, the mundane conversation of flimsy shield against the encroaching wilderness. An hour passed, then two. The humidity was suffocating, mosquitoes whined in their ears. Ben was beginning to complain about false positives on his EMF meter, blaming a nearby power line. Alistair was starting to look disappointed, as if another legend was about to crumble into rational explanation. It was Chloe who saw it first. She was staring down the dark corridor of the tracks, her eyes unfocused. "Wait," she whispered. They all followed her gaze. At first there was nothing, just an impenetrable wall of black. Then, a flicker. Far, far down the line, so distant, it could have been a firefly, a small light appeared. It wasn't the sharp, focused beam of a flashlight. It was a soft, globular glow, the color of a pale orange. It hung in the air, seemingly suspended right over the center of the tracks. "Ben, you getting this?" Alistair's voice was sharp, academic curiosity instantly replacing his disappointment. "Oh, I'm getting it," Ben breathed, his eyes glued to the screen of his thermal camera. "No heat signature. None. It's ambient temperature. It's not a flame, it's not a chemical reaction, it's just light." The orb began to move. It didn't glide smoothly, it bobbed, rising and falling gently, as if held by an unseen hand walking with a steady gait. It swayed from side to side, a lazy, rhythmic motion, the motion of a swinging lantern. "It's coming closer," Maya said, her voice tight. As it drew nearer, the quality of the light seemed to change. It intensified, then dimmed, pulsing with a slow, irregular rhythm. It cast no beam, illuminated none of the track or trees around it. It was a self-contained sphere of luminescence, a hole punched in the fabric of the night. Chloe shivered violently. "It's cold," she stammered, rubbing her arms. "Alistair, it's so cold." Ben checked his thermometer. "No, it's not. Ambient temp is stable at 82 degrees. "She's not talking about the air," Alistair said, never taking his eyes off the approaching light. He was watching Chloe now as much as the phenomenon. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something more than just fear. It was a look of profound, empathetic sorrow. "He's angry," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "He was cheated. It wasn't fair. He just wants it back." The light was now perhaps 200 yards away. It stopped.
It simply hung there in the dead air, pulsing. For a full minute it remained perfectly still. The silence was absolute. Even the frogs and insects had fallen silent again. The world was holding its breath. Then, a sound drifted down the tracks, faint but unmistakable. A metallic think, the sound of a hammer hitting a railroad spike. Chink, chink, chink. Ben frantically checked his audio levels. I'm getting it. Clean audio. No source, but it's there. The light began to move again, this time faster. It wasn't bobbing anymore. It was gliding, accelerating toward them. The soft glow intensified, brightening from a pale orange to a piercing, brilliant white. Alistair. Maya's voice was strained. This doesn't feel like swamp gas. Everybody stay calm, Alistair commanded, though his own voice was tight with adrenaline. Hold your ground. We are observers. But it's one thing to observe a distant anomaly, and another to be the focus of its attention. The light was now a blinding orb, rushing at them with unnatural speed. The feeling of cold Chloe had described washed over all of them, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt like standing in the shadow of a glacier. It was the cold of the grave. And with the cold came a feeling. A wave of pure, undiluted rage. It was a palpable emotion. A psychic scream of injustice and fury that slammed into them, making their heads spin and their stomachs clench.
Chloe let out a small cry and stumbled backward.
He's looking for it! He thinks we have it!
The light was now less than 50 yards away, a terrifying, silent projectile. Ben's equipment began to shriek, every meter redlining at once. The EMF detector screened a continuous high-pitched tone. To hell with observing, Ben yelled, grabbing his pack. We need to go, now! The spell of scientific inquiry was broken, shattered by primal fear. They turned and ran. They scrambled off the tracks, tripping over the loose gravel and discarded ties, plunging into the dark, tangled woods. Branches whipped at their faces. Thorns tore at their clothes. Alistair risked a glance over his shoulder. The light was no longer on the tracks. It had followed them. It was hovering at the edge of the woods, a silent, blazing eye, bathing the gnarled trees in its cold, white glare. It seemed to be scanning the tree line, searching. For a terrifying moment, Alistair didn't see just a light. He saw a shape within it, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette, a form made of shadow and rage, holding the light aloft. And he felt, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the figure was looking right at him. It was looking for a face. It was looking for a head. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. It didn't fade, it winked out of existence, plunging them back into the suffocating, familiar darkness. They crashed through the undergrowth until they found the dirt road and their vehicle, piling inside, gasping for breath, hearts hammering against their ribs. Ben fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking too badly to get it into the ignition. Maya was hyperventilating. Chloe was weeping quietly in the back seat, curled into a ball. Alistair Finch, the man of science, the debunker, just stared out the windshield at the wall of black trees. His entire worldview had been upended in the space of 10 minutes. He had no explanation, no theory. All he had was the lingering, icy touch of a dead man's rage and the vivid, unshakable memory of a single, searching light. They had gone to the Gurdon tracks looking for a ghost story. They had found instead that the story was looking for them.
Part 3. The Echo and the Abyss. The drive back to their motel in Arkadelphia was silent, thick with a shared, unspoken trauma. The usual post-investigation chatter, the excited debriefing, the analysis of data, the formulation of new theories, was absent. It had been replaced by the hum of the engine and the sound of their own ragged breathing. Back in the sterile anonymity of his motel room, Alistair couldn't rest. He sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the events of the night replaying in his mind on a loop. The bobbing light, the sound of the hammer, the wave of cold, raw fury, the silhouette in the glare. He had spent his career chasing shadows, explaining them away with science and logic. He dealt with creaking floorboards, house settling, cold spots, drafts, and disembodied voices, auditory pareidolia. He was a master of the rational, but there was nothing rational about what they had experienced. It wasn't a trick of the light or a pocket of gas. It was an intelligence, a malevolent, focused consciousness, locked in a loop of its own personal hell. He pulled up Maya's research on his laptop, his hands still trembling slightly. He read the old newspaper clippings about the murder of William Keating. The stark, black-and-white prose told a simple story of a workplace dispute that ended in brutal violence. He read the account of the trial, the testimony of Lou McLean, who confessed to the killing but claimed it was a fight that got out of hand. He never admitted to the decapitation, an act the prosecution painted as one of singular, cold-blooded cruelty. The head was never recovered. That sentence, buried in a dry news report from 1932, was the key. Alistair felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, a full-bodied apparition of Bill Keating. It was something more primal. The stone tape theory proposed that traumatic events could be recorded onto their physical surroundings, replaying under certain conditions like a psychic tape loop. But this was more than a recording. A recording doesn't interact. A recording doesn't hunt. What if, he thought, a sufficiently violent and unjust death doesn't just leave an echo? What if it tears a hole, a psychic wound in the fabric of reality, from which the raw, unthinking emotion of the final moments can leak out? A vortex of rage, loss, and confusion, forever anchored to the spot. The light wasn't Keating's ghost holding a lantern. The light was Keating's rage. It was his desperate, unending search, an elemental force given form.
A knock on his door made him jump. It was Chloe, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I can't sleep," she said, her voice small. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel it. The anger, and the surprise." He was hit from behind. He never knew it was coming. Alistair motioned for her to come in. "Tell me what you felt, Chloe. Everything." She sat in the room's only armchair, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's a loop, like you talked about. He walks the track. He's proud of his work. The rails are straight, the spikes are secure. He holds his lantern up. He feels satisfied. Then there's a flicker of confusion, a presence behind him. Before he can even turn, there's a burst of incredible pain, and then nothing, just blackness and shock." Her eyes were unfocused, looking at something beyond the motel room walls. And then the search begins. But he doesn't know what he's looking for. It's not a thought, it's a feeling. A terrible sense of being incomplete, of something vital being missing. He's looking for himself, his identity, his face. He sees other lights, other people, and the rage flares up because they are whole and he is not. He thinks they've stolen it from him. He thinks we stole it. Alistair listened, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Chloe's empathic reading was more terrifying than any ghost story. It wasn't the tale of a specter seeking vengeance on his killer. McLean was long dead. This was the story of a shattered consciousness, trapped in its own final horrifying moments, lashing out at anyone who strayed into its domain. "What we saw tonight," Alistair said, his voice low. "It wasn't just a local legend. It's a wound, a permanent, festering wound on the landscape. And we just poked it with a stick." He knew then that they could never release their footage. They couldn't write a paper. To do so would be profoundly irresponsible. It would be like publishing a map to a landmine. The Gurdon light wasn't a curiosity to be investigated. It was a danger to be avoided. The locals who warned people away, the teenagers who treated it as a game, they had no idea what they were playing with. They were standing on the edge of an abyss, taunting the thing that lived inside. The next morning, the team packed in silence. Ben had salvaged most of his equipment. Though the primary EMF meter was fried, its circuits melted. He didn't have to download the data to know what it would show.
The readings would be off the charts, scientifically impossible. As they were leaving, Alistair made a decision. He deleted all the files. The video of the approaching light, the audio of the spectral hammer, the telemetry data, all of it. "Alistair, what are you doing?" Ben protested, horrified. "That's the best evidence of paranormal activity ever recorded. That's the discovery of a lifetime." "Exactly," Alistair said, his eyes hard as he dragged the files to the digital trash bin and emptied it. "Some things aren't meant to be discovered, Ben. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. We weren't observers tonight, we were trespassers, and we were lucky to get away with our lives." They left Gurdon under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, leaving the lonely stretch of track to its secrets. But the experience left its own mark on each of them. Ben became more cautious, less cavalier with his technology. Maya delved deeper into the human element of folklore, understanding that myths were often born from truths too terrible to be told plainly. Chloe quit the program, unable to bear the psychic static of a world so full of pain. And Alistair Finch, the man of science, never led another field investigation. He turned his focus to the archives, to theory, becoming a remote and cautious voice in the community, warning of the dangers of seeking things that did not wish to be found. The Gurdon light still appears. On dark, moonless nights, when the air is still and heavy, it can be seen, a lone, bobbing orb moving down the iron rails. Teenagers still dare each other to walk the tracks, hoping for a glimpse of the famous ghost. They tell the story of the murdered foreman, a simple, spooky tale to make their girlfriends shriek and hold them tighter. They don't know the truth. They don't know the chilling reality behind the myth. They don't understand that the light is not a man searching for his head, but an eternal, mindless scream of rage. They don't know that with every footstep they take on that gravel, they risk drawing the attention of a fractured consciousness that sees them as thieves, intruders in its pain. The story of the Gurdon light is not over. It will never be over. It is a ceaseless watch, kept by a force born of a singular, violent moment. It waits in the Arkansas darkness, swinging its cold fire, forever walking the rails, forever searching, and forever and ever enraged.
The Shadow of the Phantom, a Texarkana Nightmare. Prologue. The Town on the Line. In the spring of 1946, Texarkana was a town humming with the triumphant yet weary energy of post-war America. It was a peculiar place, a town with 2 mayors, 2 city councils, and 2 police departments, bisected by an invisible line down the center of State Line Avenue. On one side lay Texas, on the other, Arkansas. It was a place of duality, a geographic oddity that bred a unique, self-reliant populace. The GIs were home, their pockets holding a little spending money and their hearts full of a future they had fought to secure. The air, thick with the scent of pine from the surrounding forests and the sweet perfume of magnolia blossoms, carried the promise of normalcy. Young men and women, freed from the anxieties of war, rediscovered the simple, timeless rituals of American youth. Jukeboxes, milkshakes, and the intoxicating privacy of a parked car on a lonely, moonlit road. These secluded stretches of dirt and gravel, known to generations as lovers' lanes, were an unspoken part of the town's social fabric. They were sanctuaries carved out of the dense woods that pressed in on Texarkana from all sides. Here, under a canopy of oak and pine, with only the chirping of crickets and the pale, watchful eye of the moon as witnesses, couples could steal kisses and whisper secrets, forging the bonds that would build the next generation. But in that spring of 1946, something else was stirring in the shadows of those woods. A malevolence, patient and silent, was watching. It saw the moonlight not as a romantic lantern, but as a spotlight. It saw the lovers' lanes not as sanctuaries, but as hunting grounds. The promise of the future that pulsed through the heart of Texarkana was about to be strangled by a terror so profound it would forever scar the town's soul. A phantom was waiting for his moment, and when he struck, he would drench the moonlight in blood and turn the hopeful hum of a town into a collective scream of fear. The nightmare was about to begin. Part 1. The First Tremor. On the night of Friday, February 22nd, 1946, the moon was a sliver shy of full, casting a stark, silver-blue light over the winding back roads outside Texarkana. Jimmy Hollis, 25,
a man with a steady job and the easy confidence of a returning serviceman, was behind the wheel of his sedan. Beside him sat Mary Jean Larry, a pretty vivacious 19-year-old. The war was over, the night was theirs, and the world felt wide open. They had seen a movie, and now, like countless couples before them, they sought the quiet solitude of a secluded road known locally as the Club.
They parked. The engine ticked as it cooled, the sound blending with the nocturnal symphony of the Arkansas woods. For a while, there was only the comfortable silence of two people enjoying a stolen moment. Then, another sound broke the stillness. Headlights cutting through the darkness behind them, the crunch of tires on gravel. Another car pulled up and stopped a short distance away. Jimmy didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps another couple seeking their own patch of privacy. He was wrong. A beam of light, sharp and blinding, sliced through their rear window, flooding the car's interior. Jimmy squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. A man was approaching their driver's side door. He was a silhouette, a dark shape made darker by the powerful flashlight he held. "What do you want?" Jimmy called out, his voice more annoyed than alarmed. The silhouette didn't answer. It just stood there, the light fixed on Jimmy's face. A prickle of unease ran down Jimmy's spine. This felt wrong. He opened his door to step out, to confront this intruder. As soon as he was on his feet, the figure spoke, his voice low and guttural. "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." Before Jimmy could process the words, the man raised the flashlight and brought it crashing down on his skull. The world exploded in a flash of white pain. He staggered back, struck again, this time above the eye. He fell, his head hitting the hard-packed dirt. A third blow landed, and the world went dark. Inside the car, Mary Jean screamed. The driver's door was yanked open, and the man leaned in, the flashlight beam now pinning her. She couldn't see his face, only a strange, formless shape where his head should be. It looked like a white sack, a crude hood made from a pillowcase, with rough holes cut out for eyes. It was a terrifying, inhuman visage, a featureless mask of pure menace. "Get out," the voice commanded. Her mind reeled. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else, something monstrous. The figure told her to get up and run. Trembling, she obeyed, scrambling out of the car and sprinting down the dark road. She didn't get far. He caught her easily, his grip like iron on her arm. "Now take off your panties," he ordered. Mary Jean refused. He struck her with the butt of a pistol he had pulled from his coat. The blow sent her to her knees. He hit her again. He told her to get up and start running toward a ditch by the side of the road. As she ran, a new horror unfolded behind her. Jimmy Hollis, dazed and bleeding but conscious, was getting to his feet. He saw the monstrous figure forcing Mary Jean toward the darkness, and a primal, protective instinct took over. He lunged, tackling the attacker from behind. The two men grappled in the dirt, a desperate, flailing fight in the eerie moonlight. The attacker was strong, but Jimmy was fueled by adrenaline and terror. He managed to break free and scramble back toward the road. Mary Jean, seeing her chance, fled in the opposite direction, running blindly through the woods, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. She ran until she saw the faint light of a house, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. She pounded on the door, gasping, hysterical, her story tumbling out in a torrent of sobs and terror. The police arrived to find a scene of chaos. Jimmy Hollis was dazed, his skull fractured in two places. The car was there, the door still agape. But the attacker, the man in the white sackcloth hood, was gone. He had vanished back into the night, as if swallowed by the woods themselves. The town of Texarkana awoke to the story with a shudder of disbelief. It was shocking, certainly, but most people rationalized it. A brazen robbery, a disturbed veteran perhaps, his mind warped by the horrors of war. It was a one-off, an anomaly. The police investigated, but the description was vague. A tall man, his face hidden. There were no real leads. Within a few weeks, the incident began to fade from public consciousness, dismissed as a frightening but isolated crime. The lovers' lanes, for a brief time emptier than usual,
slowly began to fill up again. As the initial fear subsided, the town breathed a sigh of relief. They had no idea that this was not an ending. It was an overture. The phantom had only been testing the waters. Part 2. The blood moon rises. The unease lingered, an unspoken chill in the March air. A month and 2 days passed. The story of Jimmy and Mary Jean became a cautionary tale, whispered among teenagers, but the raw terror had blunted. Life, as it always does, went on.
On the night of Saturday, March 23rd, another young couple sought the solace of a secluded road. Richard Griffin, 29, was a solid, dependable man. Another veteran, building a new life. With him was his girlfriend of 6 months, Polly Ann Moore, 17. She was bright and well-liked, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. They were a serious couple, the kind people expected would soon be married. After an evening with friends, they drove to a spot on Rich Road, a quiet lane known for its privacy, just across the state line in Texas. The next morning, a passing motorist saw something that made him slow his car to a stop. It was Richard Griffin's 1941 Oldsmobile sedan, parked on the shoulder of the road. The doors were closed. The lights were off. But something about it felt deeply wrong. It was too still, too silent. He peered through the window. The keys were in the ignition. The interior was undisturbed. But the car was empty. He called the authorities. The Bowie County Sheriff's deputies arrived and began a search. They called out the couple's names, their voices swallowed by the indifferent woods. They found nothing. As the hours stretched on, a sense of dread began to settle over the search party. It was a little after 9 a.m. when they found them. About 100 yards from the car, hidden from the road by a thicket of trees, lay the body of Richard Griffin. He was on his knees, slumped forward, his head resting on his clasped hands as if in prayer. His pockets had been turned inside out. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. The execution was cold, methodical. Panic began to ripple through the search party. Where was Polly Ann? They found her a few feet away, lying face down on an army blanket that had been taken from the car. She was fully clothed. She too had been shot once in the back of the head. The scene was eerily placid, a grotesque tableau under the morning sun. The killer had been patient. He had been in control. The investigators found .32 caliber shell casings on the ground, the calling card of a killer who was both armed and precise. News of the double homicide hit Texarkana like a physical blow. This was no longer an isolated assault. This was murder. The similarities to the Hollis Luray attack were chilling and undeniable. A young couple, a secluded road, a weekend night. The town's previous dismissal curdled into stark, cold fear. The police departments of both states, Texas and Arkansas, now understood they were not dealing with a simple thug. They were dealing with something far more dangerous. Newspapers, sensing the burgeoning terror, splashed the story across their front pages. They needed a name for this faceless predator, this monster who haunted the moonlight. They called him the Phantom Killer. The name stuck. It was perfect in its terrifying ambiguity. A phantom is a thing of smoke and shadow, a specter you cannot see or catch, a thing that exists only in the terror it creates. The fear was palpable now. It seeped into the very foundations of the town. Parents set strict curfews for their children. The lovers' lanes, once symbols of youthful freedom, were now utterly deserted, reclaimed by the silent, watchful woods. Gun stores saw a run on pistols and ammunition. Locks and deadbolts were installed on doors that had never needed them before. The invisible line dividing Texarkana, Texas from Texarkana, Arkansas suddenly felt like a gaping wound. The phantom had struck on both sides. No one was safe. He was out there, somewhere in the darkness, and the town held its breath, waiting for the moon to be full again. Part 3. The Phantom's Encore.
The fear became a low-grade fever, a constant simmering anxiety that infected every corner of town life. April arrived, bringing with it the sweet scent of wisteria and the promise of Easter. But the beauty of the season was a mocking counterpoint to the town's dread. Every shadow seemed a little longer, every unexpected noise a little sharper. The phantom was a ghost at their communal feast, an unseen presence that soured every pleasure. On Saturday, April 13th, the night before Easter Sunday, Texarkana was alive with the nervous energy of a town trying to pretend everything was normal. At the VFW club, a band was playing. In the center of that band, holding her saxophone, was Betty Jo Booker. At only 15, she was a prodigious talent, a girl with a bright smile and a future that seemed as golden as the notes she played. After her regular gig, she and a friend from the band, Paul Martin, 17, decided to meet up with some other friends at a local cafe. Paul was a good kid, popular and athletic. He and Betty Jo were just friends, two teenagers enjoying a Saturday night. After leaving the cafe around 1:30 a.m., Paul drove her not home but towards Spring Lake Park, a large, sprawling public space on the Texas side of town. It wasn't a traditional lover's lane, but it was a place where young people often went to talk and listen to the radio.
They never made it home. The next morning, Easter Sunday, the Martin family awoke to find Paul's bed empty. His car was gone. Panic set in immediately. They called the Booker residence. Betty Jo hadn't come home either. The families contacted the police, their voices trembling with a fear that every parent in Texarkana now knew intimately. A massive search was launched, this time with a grim sense of inevitability. At around 6:30 a.m., Paul Martin's body was found. He was lying on the side of a road near the north entrance to Spring Lake Park. He had been shot 4 times. The brutality was shocking. His body was riddled with bullets, a sign of a frenzied, explosive violence that hadn't been present at the last murder scene. His car was found a few miles away, the keys still in the ignition. But where was Betty Jo? The search for the 15-year-old girl became a desperate, town-wide obsession. Hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and Boy Scouts combed the dense woods and fields around the park. The search went on for hours under the hot Texas sun. The town waited, praying for a miracle they knew wouldn't come. Late that afternoon, some 2 miles from where Paul's body had been discovered, they found her. Betty Jo Booker lay behind a large tree, her coat buttoned up to her chin as if to ward off a chill that would never leave her. She had been shot twice, once through the chest and once in the face. Her saxophone, the instrument that had given her so much joy, was still in its case in the back of Paul's car. Texarkana broke. The thin veneer of normalcy shattered into a million pieces. This was a new level of savagery. The phantom hadn't just killed them, he had hunted them. The discovery of their bodies in separate locations painted a horrifying picture of Betty Jo's last moments, a chase, a capture, a cold-blooded execution, far from any help. Panic turned into mass hysteria. The town was under siege by an invisible enemy. The local hardware stores sold out of guns, ammunition, window locks, and screen door braces in a matter of hours. People began nailing their windows shut, barricading their doors with furniture. The streets emptied after sundown. A self-imposed curfew fell over the city, more effective than any official decree. The nocturnal hum of Texarkana was replaced by an oppressive, terrified silence. The only sounds were the barking of nervous dogs and the rustle of leaves in the wind, each one a potential footstep of the monster in the dark. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. They were outmatched and outmaneuvered. Desperate, they called for help from the best there was. From Austin came the legendary Texas Ranger, Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez. He was a figure straight out of the Old West, tall, imposing, with a pearl-handled pistol, and a reputation for relentless determination. He arrived in Texarkana like a gunslinger riding into a town plagued by outlaws, promising to hunt the phantom down. "I've come to get this man, and I'll stay until I do," he declared to the press. To the terrified citizens of Texarkana, Lone Wolf Gonzalez was their only hope. He set up a command post,
plastering the walls with maps and reports, coordinating a manhunt of unprecedented scale. But the Phantom left no clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw his face, just the .32 caliber casings and the bodies he left in his wake. He was, as his name suggested, a ghost. And he wasn't finished. Part 4. The Savage Twilight. The town of Texarkana lived in a state of suspended terror. 3 weeks passed. The full moon of April waned, and the new moon of May began to wax. The Phantom had always struck on a weekend, near a full moon. The town braced itself. Captain Gonzalez and his army of lawmen set up roadblocks and patrols, turning the quiet country roads into a web of surveillance. They were hunting the killer on his own turf, the Lover's Lanes. But the Phantom was cleverer than that. He knew he was being hunted. He knew the patterns he had established, so he broke them. On the evening of Friday, May 3rd, far from the deserted Lover's Lanes, a 37-year-old farmer named Virgil Starks was at home with his wife, Katie, 36. Their farmhouse was isolated, situated in the rural landscape northeast of Texarkana, on the Arkansas side. It was a place of quiet routine, a world away from the teenage anxieties and romances of the Phantom's other victims. Virgil sat in his favorite armchair in the living room, listening to a radio program. The windows were open to the mild night air. Katie was in their bedroom. It was a peaceful domestic scene, the kind playing out in countless homes across the nation. Suddenly, a sound shattered the peace, the tinkle of breaking glass from the back of the house. Virgil, thinking it was just the wind, got up to check. He walked into the dark kitchen. He never came back. From the bedroom, Katie heard a muffled cracking sound like a firecracker, then another. She called out for Virgil. There was no answer. A cold dread washed over her. She got out of bed and walked toward the living room. As she entered the doorway, she saw him. Virgil was slumped in his armchair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Blood was blooming on his shirt. Before she could scream, a dark figure emerged from the shadows of the kitchen. She couldn't see a face, only a silhouette against the dim light from the window. The figure raised a pistol. Katie turned and ran. She fled back into the bedroom, slamming the door shut. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The killer was right behind her, throwing his weight against the door. It splintered, but held for a second. In that fraction of a second, she scrambled to the other side of the room. The door burst open. The Phantom stood in the doorway, a hulking shape of pure malice. He raised the gun. The first shot hit her in the side of the face, shattering her jaw and knocking out several teeth. The force of it threw her to the floor. She lay there, feigning death, praying he would think she was gone. He walked over to her, stood above her, and fired again. The bullet tore through her cheek and tongue. Pain, absolute and blinding, consumed her. But through the agony, she held on to a single desperate thought. Stay still. The killer watched her for a moment, then turned and walked out of the room. She could hear him moving through the house, perhaps looking for money or other valuables. Lying in a pool of her own blood, her face a mask of agony, Katie Starks waited. She listened until the house fell silent. Then, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and an unimaginable will to live, she got up. Blood poured from her face, choking her. She stumbled out of the bedroom, past her husband's still body in the armchair, and out the front door. She ran. She ran across her yard, across the dark, empty road, to her nearest neighbor's house, a quarter of a mile away. When she staggered onto their porch, she was a horrifying apparition. Her nightgown was soaked in blood. Her face was a mangled ruin. She couldn't speak. She could only point back toward her house, toward the horror she had just escaped. The attack on the Starks farmhouse sent a new and more terrifying shockwave through Texarkana. The rules had changed. The Phantom was no longer content with ambushing teenagers in cars. He was coming into their homes. He was a boogeyman who could break through a window, a monster who could be standing in your kitchen when you turned on the light. There were no more safe places. The fear was now total and absolute. The invisible siege had become a home invasion. If you could attack a middle-aged couple in their own living room, then anyone, anywhere, was a potential victim. Part 5. The long, cold silence. The Starks attack marked the apex of the terror, and strangely, its end. After the brutal murder of Virgil Starks and the miraculous survival of his wife, the Phantom Killer vanished. The weekend passed, then another, and another. The full moon came and went. The silence was deafening. But the manhunt was more frantic than ever. Law enforcement from Texas, Arkansas, and even the FBI swarmed the region. Lone Wolf Gonzalez, his reputation on the line, chased down every lead, no matter how flimsy. Hundreds of people were questioned. Every known criminal, every recently discharged soldier with a history of violence, every oddball and recluse in a 50-mile radius was scrutinized. The town itself became a city of informants, with neighbors reporting suspicious behavior and children whispering about strange men they'd seen in the woods. Slowly, a prime suspect began to emerge from the chaos of the investigation. A 29-year-old career criminal and car thief named Ewell Swinney.
Swinney was a drifter with a long rap sheet but no history of murder. The case against him was entirely circumstantial. A fragile web of connections. Tire tracks from a stolen car he was known to have been driving were found near the Starks farmhouse. His wife Peggy was arrested with him on unrelated charges. Under intense questioning, she broke. She gave the police a detailed, horrifying confession, implicating her husband in the murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. She described how he had forced them out of the car, how he had shot Paul, and how he had then chased and killed Betty Jo. Her story fit the evidence. The police believed they had their man, but there was a problem. Under Texas law at the time, a wife could not be forced to testify against her husband. Peggy was the only witness who could place Swinney at the scene of the murders. When it came time to testify, she recanted her entire confession, claiming the police had coerced her. Without her testimony, the murder case against Ewell Swinney collapsed. They could convict him for a string of car thefts, for which he received a life sentence as a habitual offender, but they could not charge him for the Moonlight murders. The man they believed to be the Phantom Killer was behind bars, but not for being the Phantom. For the people of Texarkana, and for the frustrated lawmen, it was an unsatisfying, hollow victory. Was he really the one? The evidence was compelling but not conclusive. The .32 caliber pistol used in the murders was never found. And if he was the killer, why the sudden brutal shift in MO from lovers' lanes to a farmhouse invasion? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. The attacks stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The Phantom, whether it was Swinney or some other nameless ghoul, melted back into the shadows from whence he came. Slowly, cautiously, Texarkana began to heal. The barricades came down. The curfews lifted. Teenagers, eventually, found their way back to the lovers' lanes. But the town was never the same. A collective innocence had been murdered, along with Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, and Virgil Starks. The spring of 1946 became a black hole in the town's memory, a season of terror that would be whispered about for generations.
The Phantom Killer was never brought to justice. He became a legend, a local ghost story with the terrifying distinction of being real. His identity remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. He's a testament to a dark truth, that sometimes the monster is real. He can walk among us, and then, without reason or explanation, he can simply disappear, leaving behind only his victims, his shadow, and a silence that screams, louder than any cry of terror ever could. The moonlight over Texarkana would forever seem a little colder, a little paler, forever haunted by the memory of the Phantom.
The Silence of the Ozarks. The Unsolved Murder of Melissa Witt. The story of evil doesn't always begin with a thunderclap or a scream that tears through the night. Sometimes it begins with a feeling. A quiet, gnawing unease that settles in the pit of a mother's stomach. A cold premonition that whispers of something terribly wrong, long before the world catches up to the horror. For Marianne Witt, that feeling began on a Thursday, the first day of December, 1994. It was a day that would cleave her life in two.
creating a before and an after, with an abyss of unanswered questions lying in between. This is the story of that abyss. It's the story of her daughter, Melissa, a girl on the cusp of her future. And it's the story of a ghost, a predator who emerged from the shadows of a mundane American city, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and vanished back into them, leaving behind only silence, grief, and a single cryptic clue. Part 1. The Girl in the Mazda. To understand the darkness that consumed Melissa Missy Witt, you must first understand the light she brought into the world. At 19, Missy was the embodiment of youthful promise. A freshman at West Ark Community College in Fort Smith, Arkansas, she was a pre-veterinary student with a fierce love for animals, a passion that was more a calling than a career choice. Her friends described her as bubbly, a magnetic personality with a smile that could disarm and a laugh that was infectious. But beneath that bright exterior was a core of pure steel, a sense of responsibility and maturity that belied her years. She was the kind of daughter who called her mother just to check in, the kind of friend who would drop everything to help, the kind of student who sat in the front row. She was reliable, she was predictable. And in the world of predators, predictability can be a fatal vulnerability. The day of her disappearance, December 1st, was a Thursday painted in the dreary, gray tones of an Arkansas winter edging into its own. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of cloud. Missy's day was a portrait of routine. She attended her classes, her mind likely on upcoming finals and the approaching Christmas holiday. After class, she went to her part-time job at a local dental clinic. She was saving money, planning for a future filled with healing animals and building a life of her own. Her last known act was a testament to her thoughtful nature. She was supposed to meet her mother, Mary Ann, at their home to have dinner and exchange Christmas decorations. But Missy, ever considerate, called her mother from the clinic around 4:30 p.m. She'd forgotten a binder she needed for a test the next day and had to swing by the college to pick it up. She suggested they meet later, around 6:30 p.m., not at home, but at Bowling World. It was a familiar, cheerful place on the west side of Fort Smith, a hub of light and noise where they could grab a quick bite and make their exchange. A simple change of plans, a minor deviation in a well-trodden path. Mary Ann agreed. Why wouldn't she? It was just Bowling World, a place of laughter, of clattering pins and the scent of popcorn and shoe spray. A place so public, so drenched in fluorescent light, that darkness couldn't possibly take root there. As the afternoon bled into a cold evening, Missy drove her red Mazda MX-3 to the West Ark campus. We can only imagine her state of mind. Perhaps she was humming along to the radio, a Pearl Jam or Nirvana song filling the small car. Perhaps she was mentally reviewing anatomy terms, her brow furrowed in concentration. She retrieved her binder, a simple errand that placed her in the final hour of her known life. From there, she drove the few miles to the Bowling World parking lot on South 36th Street. She arrived a little early, pulling her car into a spot, the engine still warm, the promise of seeing her mom just minutes away. She never made it out of that car alive. Mary Ann Witt arrived at Bowling World shortly before 7 p.m. The parking lot was bustling, cars ferrying families and league bowlers to the front doors. She scanned the rows for Missy's distinctive little red sports car. She didn't see it at first and assumed she'd beaten her daughter there. She went inside, the cacophony of the alley, a stark contrast to the quiet worry beginning to bloom in her chest. She waited. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. This was not like Missy. Punctuality was etched into her daughter's DNA. Mary Ann's motherly intuition, that primal, invisible tether between parent and child, began to thrum with a discordant, terrifying note. This wasn't right. Something was wrong.
She walked back out into the biting December air, her eyes now frantically sweeping the parking lot. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a row she'd missed, there it was, Missy's red Mazda. A wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a tsunami of confusion. Why hadn't she come inside?
As Marianne approached the car, the scene that greeted her was so subtly wrong, so chillingly out of place, that it felt like a distortion of reality. The driver's side door was unlocked. Peering through the window, she saw Missy's purse sitting on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Her keys were still in the ignition. On the floor mat, a single gold hoop earring, Missy's earring, lay as if it had been torn from her ear. But the most terrifying detail was almost invisible. On the asphalt, just outside the driver's door, were tiny, dark specks, droplets of blood. And leading away from the car, scuff marks on the pavement, the ghost image of a struggle, of feet dragging against their will. Missy was gone. Her car, her purse, her keys, her entire identity were left behind. She had been erased from the scene, plucked from the safety of a well-lit public place by an unseen hand. The scream that had been building inside Mary Ann finally erupted. The quiet premonition had become a full-throated, waking nightmare. The abyss had opened. Part 2. The 43 Days of Silence. The initial police response was swift, but the scene itself was a puzzle of contradictions. An abduction in a crowded parking lot, yet no one had seen a thing. No witnesses heard a scream over the din of the bowling alley. No one saw a second vehicle pull up, or a man force a young woman from her car. It was as if the perpetrator was a phantom, moving through the world on a different frequency. The Fort Smith Police Department, led by Detective Larry R. Jones and Sergeant J. L. Davis, cordoned off the Mazda. The car was a sterile tomb of Missy's last moments. Her school binder was there, a half-empty bottle of soda, all the mundane artifacts of a life interrupted. Forensics teams combed the area, collecting the blood droplets for analysis. In 1994, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, but they knew it could be the key. They bagged the lone earring, a tiny monument to a violent struggle. The investigation exploded outward. Who would want to harm Missy Witt? The question seemed absurd. She had no known enemies. Her life was an open book of school, work, and family. Detectives began the grim, methodical work of dissecting that life. They interviewed her friends, her ex-boyfriends, her co-workers. They painted a picture of a sweet, unassuming girl. No secret life, no drug involvement, no shady connections. She was exactly who she appeared to be. This very normalcy was terrifying. It meant the motive wasn't personal revenge or a soured relationship. It pointed to something far more sinister, a stranger abduction, the work of a predator, the type of crime that terrifies communities because it suggests that no one is safe, that evil can be random, patient, and utterly detached. As the days turned into a week, then two, the city of Fort Smith held its breath. Missy's face, her bright smile frozen in a school portrait, was everywhere. On telephone poles, in store windows, on the nightly news. The story sent a shockwave of fear through the region. Parents held their children tighter. College students walked to their cars in pairs, keys clutched like weapons. For Marianne Witt, the world had shrunk to the four walls of her home, the telephone its torturous centerpiece. Every ring sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, a spike of hope followed by the crushing despair of it being a well-wisher or a reporter, but never the call she needed. She was living in a state of suspended animation, trapped between the fading hope that Missy was alive and the encroaching terror of what might have happened to her. The Christmas decorations they were supposed to exchange sat in a box, a painful reminder of a stolen moment, a stolen future. The holiday season, with its cheerful carols and twinkling lights, became a cruel mockery of her grief. Massive search parties were organized. Hundreds of volunteers, strangers moved by the family's plight, fanned out across the fields and wooded areas around Fort Smith. They trudged through frigid mud and tangled underbrush, calling Missy's name into the uncaring wind. They found nothing. It was as if she and her abductor had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The police were drowning in tips, most of them dead ends. Psychics called with visions. Crank callers tormented the family with false claims. Investigators chased down leads that led them in circles. They looked at known sex offenders in the area. They created profiles of the potential killer, organized, confident, likely familiar with the area, and bold enough to strike in a public place. He would have used a blitz-style attack, overwhelming Missy with speed and violence before she could react, silencing her before she could scream. He would have had a vehicle ready, a place to take her, a plan. This was not an amateur.
The 43 days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into a special kind of hell. It was the hell of the unknown. Was she being held somewhere? Was she cold? Was she frightened? Every passing moment was a new torture for her family.
a new victory for the monster who held her fate in his hands. The silence from her captor was absolute. There was no ransom demand, no taunting message, just a void. A profound and terrifying silence that stretched across Christmas and into the new year. The world celebrated a new beginning while the wits remained frozen in their nightmare, waiting for an ending, any ending, to the torment. Part 3. The Discovery in the Woods. The end of the waiting came on Friday, January 13, 1995. The date itself, steeped in superstition, felt like a final, cruel twist of the knife. The discovery was not made by law enforcement or volunteer search parties. It was made some 50 miles away from Fort Smith, in a place of rugged, desolate beauty, the Ozark National Forest. Near the Turner Bend area of Franklin County, 2 fur trappers were making their way through the dense wintry woods near a mountain pass called Stinking Creek Road. It was a remote location, a place of deep ravines and thick canopies, where the silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth. As they navigated the difficult terrain, a flash of something unnatural caught their eye. Lying in the frozen leaf litter, partially concealed by brush, was a human form. They approached with caution, their hearts pounding in their chests. It was the body of a young woman. She was nude, her head covered by her own hair, which had been matted and arranged in a way that seemed almost deliberate. A final act of desecration. They knew, with a sickening certainty, who they had found. They hiked out of the wilderness and found the nearest phone to call the authorities. When investigators arrived, they secured a scene that was both tragic and forensically rich. The area was remote enough that it had been largely preserved from the elements and human interference. Missy Witt lay on her back. The cause of death was not immediately obvious, but it would later be determined by the medical examiner that she had been strangled, likely with a belt. The terror of her final moments was unimaginable. As crime scene technicians meticulously documented the area, they found her clothing, her jeans, her sweater, her underwear, in a neat folded pile a short distance from her body. This was a chilling detail. It wasn't the frenzied, chaotic act of a disorganized killer. Folding the clothes suggested a calm, methodical, and ritualistic mind. It was a sign of a predator who was in complete control, savoring his work. But then they found the 2 items that would come to define the entire case, the central pillars of a mystery that endures to this day. The first was found with Missy's body. Clipped to the nipple of her left breast was a small silver clip-on earring. It was ornate, with a distinctive starburst or sunray pattern. It was not hers. Missy had pierced ears. She would have no need for a clip-on. And this earring was a single, not a pair. Police immediately understood its significance. It had to belong to the killer, or perhaps the killer's wife or girlfriend. It was a trophy taken from another life, another victim, or a personal item dropped in the violent struggle. It was the killer's calling card, left on the body of his victim. The second piece of evidence was microscopic. From the crime scene and from Missy's body, technicians were able to recover a viable DNA profile of an unknown male. In the world of 1990s forensics, this was a potential silver bullet. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint. All they needed was a name to match it to. The official identification confirmed what everyone had feared. The body in the woods was Melissa Witt. The 43-day vigil was over. The search for a missing girl had now become a hunt for a murderer. A murderer who had left behind his DNA and a single bizarre clue, as if daring the world to find him. Part 4. The Ghost and the Earring. With the discovery of Missy's body, the investigation was re-energized, but it was also now a race against a cooling trail. The killer had a 43-day head start. The focus shifted to the 2 pieces of physical evidence, the DNA and the earring. The DNA was entered into the nascent CODIS Combined DNA Index System database, but there was no match. This meant the killer was not a convicted felon already in the system. He was a ghost, a clean citizen walking free. Over the years, that DNA sample has been run against the database thousands of times as it has grown exponentially. It has never once hit a match. He has never been arrested for another crime that required a DNA sample. Or if he has, he somehow managed to avoid giving one. The earring then became the object of intense focus. It was so unique, so specific. Investigators released photos of it to the public, hoping someone would recognize it. A woman who had lost it, a jeweler who had sold it, a friend who had seen it on someone. The earring was shown on national television shows like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. Thousands of tips poured in. Women from all over the country sent in their own similar-looking earrings. Each one was painstakingly ruled out. The earring from the crime scene remained an anomaly, its origins as mysterious as the killer himself. Who was this man? Criminal profilers, including experts from the FBI, worked to build a sketch of the Phantom. He was likely a white male, probably in his 20s or 30s at the time. He was intelligent, organized, and forensically aware. He chose his victim and location with care. The abduction at Bowling World suggested he may have stalked Missy, learning her routine. Or perhaps he was an opportunistic predator who simply saw a young woman alone in her car and seized the moment. The location where he left her body, deep in the Ozarks, suggested an intimate knowledge of the area. He was not a transient just passing through. He was a local or someone who worked or recreated in those woods. A hunter, a fisherman, a park ranger, someone who knew the back roads and the isolated spots where a body would not be easily found.
The folding of the clothes and the placement of the earring suggested a psychosexual component to the crime. He was a trophy taker, a ritualist. This was likely not his first act of violence, and it may not have been his last. He derived a sense of power and control from the act, from the terror he inflicted. Over the years, a handful of persons of interest have emerged. One was a man who worked for a traveling magazine sales company, whose territory included Fort Smith. He reportedly owned a pair of clip-on earrings for his mother. Another was a man who confessed to the crime from prison, but his story was riddled with inconsistencies, and he couldn't provide details that weren't already public knowledge. He was ultimately dismissed as a liar seeking attention. Perhaps the most compelling theory involves a now-deceased U.S. Forest Service employee who worked in the Ozark National Forest. He matched the physical profile, knew the area where Missy's body was found, like the back of his hand, and was known to have a dark side. A woman who knew him claimed he had given her a pair of earrings identical to the one found on Missy. When she saw the earring on the news, she confronted him. He allegedly became enraged, took the matching earring from her, and was never seen with them again. After his death, investigators searched his belongings, but the earring was never found. Without a DNA match, the theory remains just that, a tantalizing but unprovable ghost story. Epilogue: The Whispering Woods. Decades have passed, the red Mazda has long since been returned and likely scrapped. The bowling alley has changed names, the investigators have retired, passing on the thick, heavy case files to a new generation of detectives who feel the weight of its failure. But some things have not changed.
Mary Ann Witt never gave up. Until her own death in 2015, she was a relentless force for justice for her daughter. She kept the case in the public eye, gave countless interviews, and established a reward fund that has grown to a substantial sum. She became the keeper of Missy's flame, a mother whose love was so powerful it refused to let the world forget the girl with the bubbly laugh and the promising future. Her fight is now carried on by others, an army of online sleuths, and a dedicated team of retired detectives called the Cold Case Commandos, all bound by a common goal: to give Missy Witt her name back and identify the monster who took her. The case of Melissa Witt remains one of America's most haunting unsolved homicides. It is a chilling testament to the fact that monsters are not mythical creatures. They live among us. They go to work, they pay their taxes, and they hide in plain sight. The killer is now likely in his 50s or 60s. Does he still live in Arkansas? Does he ever drive past the old Bowling World and feel a flicker of pride? Does he see Missy's face on a cold case documentary and smile? Or is he tormented by his secret, haunted by the ghost of the girl he murdered on a cold December night? The silence he created on December 1st, 1994, continues to echo. It echoes in the hearts of those who loved Missy. It echoes in the unsolved files of the Fort Smith Police Department.
and it echoes in the deep, dark woods of the Ozark National Forest, where on a cold January morning, a secret was revealed, but a killer's identity remained hidden. The woods hold many secrets, and somewhere out there is a man who holds the biggest secret of all. He holds the truth, he holds the matching earring, and he holds the memory of his victim, a final, terrible trophy in a life lived in the shadows. The hunt for the ghost of the Ozarks is not over. It will not be over until the silence is finally broken.